Hello all. This is the research paper Q&A video for Religious Studies 100, the New Testament. I've compiled the list of questions that you all have submitted on Google Forms for the past week or two, and have broken these into different categories based on whether they're general questions, questions about formatting, etc. If you have any more questions about the paper after this video, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I noticed that a lot of these questions overlap with the guidelines that I've put on Blackboard for the research paper. So before you begin the paper, make sure that you read those guidelines thoroughly. I noticed, like I said, many of these questions kind of just ask the same questions that are there. So please make sure that you're thoroughly reading all of the material that I provide for this class. So for those questions, I'll kind of gloss over the answers. But for some of these, I also noticed that they're very specific based on your research. So if you have a very specific question, as I noted in the Google form, please make sure to email me directly. This is kind of for general questions that might apply to all students. So I've got the list here for you all to see, and I'm going to go through each of these. So several people have been concerned about what's the point of the paper is, what to write in the paper, and how to start it. So the paper is, as I said, an exegesis paper. This means the point is to look at a passage and determine what the context and literary value of that passage is. So somebody here said, for this paper is another goal to explain the text chosen from a historical standpoint. And this is a pretty good way to put it, actually. So you're going to be looking at the text, and I think the New Testament is sometimes hard to step back from and evaluate as a historical text. But think about if you were studying, say, Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. You're not going to focus on what you believe, what somebody else believes about the text, but kind of focusing on what happened at this historical time period. What kind of literary value can we find in the text? What metaphors, symbolism, etc. is used? And this is what you're going to do with your passage in this class. So in whatever passage you're working with, you'll have 5 to 10 verses. And for each verse, you're going to consider, and most of you have already started this with your brainstorming, what kind of information do we need to know to understand the historical context of this passage better? So these are going to be things like who wrote the text, when was the text written, what's the purpose of the text, what's the audience of the text. And then you're also going to want to look at literary aspects of the verse. So maybe there's words that you don't understand or maybe have different meanings. For example, when you get into John, you get the light of the world and those ideas. So in those cases, you'll want to think, this is odd imagery that stands out differently from other places in the New Testament. So where did this come from? So if you're working with John, you might look into the historical context of that and find out that there might be ties to Gnosticism, which is an early Christian branch of sorts that was usually considered heretical. So there's going to be kind of breaking down the text and thinking through what things stand out to you. And these aren't going to be simply questions of, I wonder what's going on here, but thinking through specific word usage, metaphors, symbols, and historical context or historical events that are mentioned. So the biggest question is the goal in writing it, how to properly write it. I think I've covered that. And I don't remember if it's in this class or another, but somebody did ask about whether you're just breaking down the text or coming up with a theme for the text. And for both of those, it's a yes. So you will want to be breaking down the text, thinking through each verse separately, and being able to explain what's going on in that verse. You also will want to, after you've done that, so I don't expect much in your introduction until you get to about the rough draft of your paper, but after you've kind of broken down each verse, pulled in some research, think about what are the main conclusions that you can draw from this passage. So what's the main theme? What are the main ideas? Or how does this relate to the New Testament as a whole? So after you've worked through the text, that's going to be something you want to look into. Analyzing a text full of metaphors for examples of culture, that's obviously specific to someone's paper. So make sure to reach out to me if you have any questions. I would say just generally, you're going to analyze that the same way that you would any other passage. Yes, you're coming up with your own questions to analyze throughout the paper. You're starting this with the brainstorming, but I'm also going to provide you some questions that I think are also important to consider. My main suggestion here with really anybody's paper is always consider kind of what I consider the 5 literary criticism steps. Consider who the author is, what the composition date is, what the purpose of the text is, what the audience of the text is, and historical context. So I think for any of your papers, that's going to be something important to do. The percentage of your grade that this is worth is, sorry, wrong thing, is 35%. So the research paper is worth the most points of any other assignment in the course. So 35% includes the final draft, which is worth 150 points, so 15% of your final grade. But it also includes the brainstorming, the annotated bibliography, outline, rough draft, and then your notes and comments. And all of these steps, usually, and unless you really just didn't meet requirements, usually you earn full points on if you met the requirements and showed that you put in some effort. So I wouldn't be too concerned about your grade. The reason I do the research paper in steps is so that by the time you get to the final draft, you already know what my comments on your paper are, and you can take these and work with them so that you can establish a really good final draft. Usually in my classes, unless a student just isn't meeting requirements or not following guidelines, I usually don't see grades below an A or a B. So if you're not good at writing papers, that's okay. That's the whole point of having a 6-step paper in this class, is that with each step, I give you feedback so that you can use that in the next step to continue working on your research. I definitely don't think that submitting a term paper in December that you've never gotten any feedback on is any good educational practice. So my point in this, and I know it can be stressful with a research paper, but the point is so that you get feedback as you're moving along. So I think I covered that about history of the passage and explaining what the passage means. Don't know why this showed up smaller, but this question is, are we allowed to compare the passage we chose from the Bible we're using from this class to other versions of the verse, for example, King James Version? I would answer yes, cautiously. So you're welcome to do some comparison with translations, but make sure that this doesn't, overshadow your focus on the history and meaning of the passage. So in some cases, you might find something interesting with translation, but for the most part, keep your focus just on NRSV and explaining the history and meaning of the passage. My best suggestion for being successful in the paper is simply reading the guidelines and reaching out when you have problems. So most students who earn poor grades on a paper are students who have never contacted me to ask questions about the paper. I have office hours each week, and I know that there's some cancellations, but I'm also happy to schedule an appointment with you. Towards the end of the semester, I also have extra credit meeting opportunities. So you can meet with me, earn extra credit points, and it helps you work through your paper and kind of work out some of the kinks. So reaching out, and it can just be via email, but reaching out whenever you have questions is definitely my suggestion for being the most successful on this paper. Any certain type of information to include, like certain questions, really any information that I think you need to include is going to be feedback that I leave you for each step. So in your brainstorming activity, I've left feedback for more questions to consider or things to include. Again, those 5 steps of literary criticism, authorship, composition date, purpose, etc. those are going to be the information you want to include in a context section, but everything else is really just thinking through each verse. Here's the question about the theme. So yes, by the end of the paper, I think it would be helpful to come up with a theme, and this is what you're going to talk about in your thesis statement. But as you begin the paper, this isn't really a concern. This is something you'll think about as you work through the steps. But by the end of your outline, you should have a decent idea for what the theme of the passage is. An example of a strong non-confessional research paper, there's actually one on Blackboard under readings and handouts. It's an example that a student wrote several years ago in my Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures class, but it follows the same kind of setup. The paper is not perfect. There's a few issues with APA formatting, but overall it's a really strong paper, and the student did a fantastic job working through the passage and discussing the historical context as well as why the passage matters. So you're welcome to look through that on Blackboard, and I think that would help give you a good idea for what I'm looking for. Concerns about misinterpreting the text and writing a very incorrect paper. Assuming that you are using reliable scholarly sources, which we'll talk about with annotated bibliography, and you're following the guidance that I give you on each step of the paper, this is not something you should be too concerned about. If I notice that you're misinterpreting some texts, and there's some issues that I've already noticed with the brainstorming, then I'll leave you a note saying, think about what the historical context would be, or where are you seeing this pop up, because it doesn't. So this is something that if you get to your rough draft and you've kind of continued along these misinterpretations, I've probably given you notes to change it by that point. So if you're still concerned about that, feel free to reach out. Feel relatively confident in your ability to write a research paper, but you're concerned about the details attached to formatting and submission, and that religion is going to be difficult to write about in a non-confessional manner. So I'll talk about this last point here in a bit. As for formatting and submission, formatting guidelines are on Blackboard under the guidelines. I'm kind of looking for your basic 12-point Times New Roman font. The only difference with my paper versus other papers you'll probably encounter is including the verse that you're working on in bold before you get into discussing the verse. So you can see this in the sample research paper that the student submitted. I also will try to find an old Greek exegesis paper that I wrote that follows the same formatting. So that should help you understand what the format should look like. So for submission, I'm simply looking for you to submit or kind of keep track of it via Google Docs. And then you're just going to submit a regular Word document or a PDF on Blackboard. So I don't expect that the submission issue should be too much of a problem. I've noticed quite a few issues with sharing the Google Docs, so I've created a video for you all to look at to help you with that. You're concerned that your passage is not good enough to write about. Again, this is very specific, so I'm not sure what passage you're talking about, but if you're concerned, feel free to reach out to me. If I've told you that you're good to go to work on that passage, then it's probably fine. But if you're still concerned or you're having difficulty working on it, then just email me. Do you need to quote from the New Oxford Bible, or can we use an alternative Bible? The verses that you're using, so the passage you compile will be from the NRSV, the New Oxford Annotated Bible that we're using for this course. So you're welcome to, like I said earlier, look at other translations. Maybe that helps you think through how a word is used, but your focus and the quotations from the Bible must be from the NRSV translation. All right, so sources, and this will be something that you're getting into with the annotated bibliography. How can I tell if an article is biased or not? And if it is, how do I combat it in a non-confessional way? Not always, but something to look for is use of first person pronouns. So you'll see we, I, me, sometimes you as a second person pronoun. This is not always the case, but you often find that kind of language in biased articles. Also consider, is the approach that the author's taking simply historical fact-based, or are they making some kind of claims about religious beliefs or how somebody should interpret the text? If you're using a biased article, which I would recommend staying away from as much as possible, you can still use that by claiming, oh, this author has this belief system, or this is an author who works at this confessional university, and just kind of framing it, letting the reader know where this person's coming from before you get into their research. Specific sources or websites that would be useful for us to look into. I should have a list of that on the guidelines already. One website that I would recommend is a list of commentaries, because you'll need commentaries for your paper. And I'm 99% sure that's on the guidelines for you to access. BibleOdyssey.org is also a fantastic website that provides really good scholarly articles, but is still open resource, easy to use. Biblical Archaeology is also, I believe, .org, is also a great source that should help you with some of the historical context of your passage. Most things that you're going to find through WKU library databases and through just WKU libraries as a whole will be good sources. Really, if you're having trouble finding a source, then feel free to reach out. As for commentaries, I would highly recommend the New International Commentary on the New Testament series. You also might find the Hermeneia series helpful. Those two commentaries you usually can find at WKU Library. You can also sometimes find these on Scribd, or sometimes even as PDFs online. So those are the two commentary series I would recommend looking at. What sources would you recommend that I use for my annotated bibliography? So for sources, you will need at least, I think I say at least two, but I definitely want to see at least one verse by verse commentary. So these are going to be ones that break the text up in a very similar method to how you're going to. So it's going to work through, here's a verse, so say John 1:1, and then it talks about that verse for usually several pages in these books. And then it'll go John 1:2, and then talk about that verse and so on. So you'll need at least one or two of those type of books for your annotated bibliography. Besides that, I'd recommend looking at journals. The Journal of Biblical Studies is a good one. Journal of Biblical Literature. You can find Novum Testamentum. There's quite a few different journals out there. And again, WK Libraries is the best place that I would recommend for you to start your research. I think that covers that as well. For the secondary source required for the outline, would a website work, or are you looking for something else? So the secondary sources in the outline are going to be the same as what you're using in your annotated bibliography. So whatever secondary sources you've used so far are going to be what you pull into your outline. These might be books. So these commentaries that you're going to use, they might be websites like BibleOdyssey.org. Whatever type of source you're using here, just make sure that it is a scholarly, non-confessional source and is reliable. So the research and writing worksheet should help you kind of consider what texts are reliable texts and what are not. If you're concerned about anything, then please feel free to reach out, because I am happy to help you out with that. Contacting the library for assistance. You should be able to, on the library website, there's at the bottom right a chat tab that you can talk with a reference librarian just from your computer. You can also go into the library and say, this is what I'm working on. Do you have any suggestions? They are not, they are experts at finding resources in the library, but remember that they are not experts in writing about the Bible in a non-confessional matter. So sometimes they might help you find sources that maybe are biased. So just keep that in mind as you're looking through those. Some concerns about confessionalism. how do I catch myself from slipping into non-confessional writing? Worried about staying true to the non-confessional type of writing style, distancing myself from personal beliefs, and what is non-confessional commentary. So we've talked about what being non-confessional means, right? So it means that you're looking at your research from a fact-based point of view rather than a faith-based point of view. So this means you're going to use the tools for academic study. You're going to look at historical criticism, literary criticism, and really kind of step back from the text as a religious text and consider it from a historical standpoint. So like I mentioned earlier, you're not looking at Homer's Iliad from your own personal religious beliefs, more than likely, but thinking of it for its literary and historical value. And that's kind of the thing you're going to be doing here. You'll find commentaries in the Bible very frequently, especially in Christian or religious bookstores. And they walk you through the Bible in a confessional manner. So they'll say, this verse means, and go into how it can be applied to people's lives today, as well as some of the historical context. So what you're going to be doing in this paper is basically the historical context point of view and not the application to how people can believe in it today. I would recommend to keep yourself from slipping into confessional writing is first, not worry about it as you're starting off. So write your paper and just get through it. And then afterwards, look back over it and think, are all of my claims supported by research? Are any of these things that are just preconceived ideas about the text? With each step that you submit, this is something that I notice. If I notice that you're having a hard time with this, I'm going to reach out to you. And I don't take off for confessional perspectives until the final draft. So if I'm noticing, you submit your annotated bibliography and I say, oh, some of these sources are confessional and you're taking a confessional approach, here's some ways to fix that. And then I notice some issues with your outline still. I might say, you need to change these things or consider this different point of view. The same will happen with your rough draft. By that point, I'm expecting when you get to your final draft that you fix these issues. So if you haven't, then that would be the place that it would affect your grade. But otherwise, I'm wanting you to kind of work through the passage and I'll let you know if I notice any issues. For formatting, using APA, how to set up your paper. Does it have to be an APA or MLA? So formatting guidelines you can find in the guidelines for the research paper. You're welcome to use APA, MLA, or Chicago style. Just make sure that whatever style you choose that you're consistent with. So I don't want to see you use an APA cover page and then MLA in-text citations and then Chicago style bibliography. Just make sure that if you do APA, it's consistent throughout. Again, with most steps of the paper, I'm not going to be very hard on your formatting, but I will let you know if I'm noticing some issues with it. So with your outline, for example, as long as you meet the basic requirements, if you have some issues with your APA or MLA or Chicago style formatting, you're not going to lose points for that. Your final draft is where I'm expecting to see a well-polished paper. As for length of the paper, so someone's concerned about the length. So the length of the paper is 4 to 6 pages, not including the bibliography. And this is not going to be a very long paper compared to other papers that you'll write in college. For this paper, since so much of it is including your passage, honestly, you'll probably look at writing about 3 of your own pages because almost a whole page will be broken up, but almost a whole page of your paper will be the passage that you're working with. So if you're having a hard time meeting the length requirements, then I would recommend making sure that you're actually finding research for the paper. I think most students who are actually following guidelines and researching their passage typically have the opposite issue, especially if they've chosen a passage of 10 verses rather than 5. So you're going to find quite a bit of information depending on the passage you're working with. And I don't anticipate you'll have any issues meeting length requirements unless you're just, not following guidelines or researching. If this is something that you're struggling with, so you're working through the semester and you still can't meet length requirements, again, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to help you think through some more questions, or maybe you need to expand your passage or something like that. For annotated bibliography, which is coming up soon, the annotated bibliography format, I have an MLA one as an example on the annotated bibliography turn-in link, but you're welcome to use APA or Chicago depending on what you do. Just make sure that you're following whatever style you're doing. So you'll have the full bibliographic entry, not just a URL, full bibliographic entry, and then you're going to talk about what the source is about and how it relates to your research. Annotated just means that you're basically providing notes about it. So just like you have the New Oxford Annotated Bible, and each verse or most verses have notes at the bottom explaining what the verses mean, that's going to be something that you'll do in your annotated bibliography for each source you're consulting. There is an example, so somebody asked to provide an example. There is an example on Blackboard, and this is under, so if you go to the research paper on the left-hand side of Blackboard, click on that, and then click on annotated bibliography. Below where you click the turn-in link, there is a link to a sample annotated bibliography. And you're welcome to use that to kind of see what an annotated bibliography should look like. It would be better to start with the URL and the guidelines page, or to start looking for sources through Google. I would recommend, you're welcome to start either way. If you're struggling to find sources, then I would recommend the URL and the guidelines. So that's the one that links to the commentaries. My suggestion would be not doing Google, but doing WKU Library as your primary source search. So Google Scholar can have some good sources, but you might not always be able to access them, and they encompass a wide variety of sources. So I would recommend focusing on the WKU Library website. So it's www.wku.edu/library. And then in that search bar, you can search for whatever passage you're working on, any themes in that passage, and that should help you find some good sources. And then notes and comments. Do they have to be spread out over? Yes, they have to be spread out over a period of 3 weeks. Will you tell us when to start leaving comments in our lessons, or will we have to automatically know to start 3 weeks prior? So I'm expecting you all to be able to keep up with your work. So you should automatically know that you need to start these 3 weeks prior. My thought here is that each week you're kind of looking through, or each week that something's due, you're looking through each other's papers. And this should help you with your own research as well, to see what everybody else is doing, because maybe there's some ideas that you hadn't considered, or realize that your formatting's off after seeing 20 students do the same formatting. So let me look at my calendar real quickly. All right, so November 15th would be 3 weeks before the December 6th due date. So by November 15th, you need to be starting your notes and comments. These can be, so it's 15 total, 5 of them can be on your own work. I also have my own research paper up there, and you are welcome to leave comments there as well. But November 15th is your start date if you're really concerned about doing that, but don't want to work ahead. But I would recommend working on this ahead of time. That's the whole point of this. It covers all of the questions that you all submitted in this course for the Q&A. If you have any more questions, or still have some questions after watching this, or there's anything I didn't cover, then please feel free to reach out. Again, make sure you're reading the guidelines and the syllabus, because this is going to be what really helps you get started. And anything else, just feel free to send me an email, I'm happy to meet during office hours, and there's also the weekly Q&A where I'm going to respond with videos like this if I receive any questions. So feel free to submit questions there.